The Post Roads of Early America, Connecting the Colonies, 1780 to 1800. The War for Independence had ended. The cannons had cooled, the smoke had cleared from the battlefields of Yorktown and Saratoga, and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 had officially severed the political ties with Great Britain. But as the euphoria of victory faded, the new United States faced a quiet, formidable geographic reality. It was a nation of immense silence. From the granite coasts of New England to the sandy marshes of Georgia, the 13 states were separated not by enemies, but by distance. In the years between 1780 and 1800, the true challenge of nation-building was not fought with muskets, but with surveyors' chains, axes, and the hooves of horses. The task was to stitch these isolated pockets of civilization together into a cohesive whole. The needle was the postrider, and the thread was the road. To understand the United States in this era, one must lower their gaze from the soaring rhetoric of liberty down to the ground, specifically to the mud. In the 1780s, the term road was a generous description for the paths that connected the American states. These were not the graded, paved, or engineered highways of the Roman Empire. They were open wounds in the forest floor. The King's Highway, which would eventually evolve into the famous Boston Post Road, was the primary artery of the nation, yet for much of the year, it was nearly impassable. Imagine a journey in late March. The winter snows are melting, turning the packed earth into a viscous, ankle-deep quagmire. A postrider, tasked with carrying the mail from New York to Philadelphia, did not gallop. There was no thunder of hooves. There was only the wet, sucking sound of mud gripping the horse's legs. The pace was agonizingly slow. A mile might take 20 minutes to traverse. The rider would have to navigate around fallen oak trees, ford swollen streams where bridges had been washed away, and pick his way through fields of jagged stumps left behind by hasty clearing. In the low-lying areas, particularly in Virginia and the Carolinas, the roads were often corduroyed. This was a primitive method of paving used to keep carriages and horses from sinking into the swamps. Laborers would cut down pine logs, roughly 10 to 12 feet in length, and lay them side by side across the muddy path, perpendicular to the direction of travel. For a sleep-deprived postrider or a passenger in a stagecoach, the corduroy road was a test of endurance. The logs were uneven. They were slippery with moss and rot. As the wheels of a cart rolled over them, they created a rhythmic, bone-jarring vibration, bump, 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 that could rattle the teeth and bruise the spine. This was the texture of travel in early America. It was a physical ordeal. The mail did not glide, it lurched. And yet, despite the mud and the logs, the mail moved. It moved because the Constitution demanded it. In the summer of 1787, the Founding Fathers gathered again in Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation were failing. The central government was too weak to tax, too weak to raise an army, and too weak to bind the states together. They needed a new framework. Throughout the sweltering heat of that summer, as arguments raged over representation and slavery, a quiet consensus was forming around the issue of communication. The framers understood that a republic could not survive if Georgia did not know what New York was doing. If the states remained isolated islands of information, the Union would fracture. And so, in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 7 of the United States Constitution, a simple, unadorned sentence was written. It gave Congress the power to establish post offices and post roads. It's a short sentence, easily overlooked, but in the context of history, it was a monumental claim of sovereignty. By giving the federal government the power to build post roads, the Constitution was effectively saying that the government had the right to physically shape the landscape. It could cut paths through private land. It could designate specific routes as vital to the national interest. The post office was not just a business, it was part of the skeleton of the federal government. With the ratification of the Constitution, the system began to formalize. In 1789, Samuel Osgood was appointed the first Postmaster General under the new Constitution. The headquarters moved to New York City, then the temporary capital. The archives from this period paint a picture of a frugal, almost austere operation. The entire headquarters consisted of Osgood, a secretary, and a single clerk. From this tiny room, they managed a network that included 75 post offices and roughly 2,400 miles of post roads. But the real transformation happened in 1792. Congress passed the Postal Service Act of 1792, a piece of legislation that is arguably as important as the Bill of Rights for the development of American culture. This act did two profound things. First, it guaranteed the privacy of the mail. It made a crime for postal officials to open letters. In an era where European monarchs routinely spied on their subjects' correspondence, the United States made a radical decision. The government would carry your secrets, but it would not read them. The seal on a letter became a legal sanctuary. This built a deep trust in the system. People felt safe sending money, contracts, and political opinions to the saddlebags of the government writers. Second, the act heavily subsidized the distribution of newspapers. It allowed newspapers to be mailed for a mere 1 cent rapidly, or 1.5 cents for longer distances, rates that were far below the actual cost of transport. Personal letters, which were expensive to send, effectively subsidized the news. The Founding Fathers believed that an informed electorate was the safeguard of liberty. They wanted newspapers from Boston to be read in Baltimore. They wanted the debates of Congress to reach the log cabins of the frontier. The result was an explosion of paper. By the mid-1990s, the postwriter's bag was no longer just filled with personal missives, it was bulging with the Pennsylvania Gazette, the New York Packet, and the Columbian Sentinel. The mailbag became the primary vector of knowledge. Let us return to the road, to the physical experience of moving this paper. The speed of information was inextricably linked to the biology of the horse. In the 1990s, there were no steam engines, no telegraph wires. The fastest a thought could travel was the speed of a galloping horse. But the reality was often a trot or a walk. A typical postwriter in this era was a young man, often a teenager. He was light to spare the horse. He carried a small brass horn. As he approached a settlement or a post office, he would blow the horn, a clear, piercing note that cut through the ambient sounds of the wind in the woods. This sound was a signal to the postmaster to get the mailbag ready, and a signal to the hostler that a hungry man and a thirsty horse were arriving. The horses were not thoroughbred racers. They were sturdy, road-hardened animals, often Morgans or Narragansett Pacers, breeds known for their endurance and sure-footedness. A horse could not run indefinitely. The system relied on stages, typically spaced 10 to 15 miles apart. At each stage, the rider would dismount. The mail portmanteau would be unstrapped. A fresh horse, already saddled and waiting in the stable, would be brought out. The transition was a study in practiced efficiency. The smell of the stable, old hay, manure, leather oil, and sweat was the perfume of the Postal Service. The hostler, the stableman, would check the shoes of the fresh horse. A loose shoe on a rocky road could lame a horse in minutes, delaying the mail by hours. The rider might take a quick drink of cider or water, perhaps a bite of hard bread, and then he was up again. Creak of leather, thud of hooves. The silence of the road returns. The speed was dictated by the contract. The Postmaster General signed contracts with private individuals to carry the mail on specific routes. These contracts specified the departure and arrival times down to the hour. For example, a contract might require the mail to leave Philadelphia on Monday at 8 a.m. and arrive in Baltimore by Wednesday at noon. If the rider was late, the contractor was fined. This created a relentless pressure to keep moving. Night riding became common on the main routes. Imagine the sensory deprivation of riding through a dense New England forest at 2 a.m. on a moonless night. The rider could not see the road. He had to trust the horse. He had to trust that the animal could sense the path, smelling the damp earth of the trail, avoiding the trees by instinct. The isolation was absolute. The only company was the rhythmic breathing of the horse and the hoot of an owl. In winter, the conditions became life-threatening. The post road could disappear entirely under 2 feet of snow. In these times, the riders abandoned their horses and switched to sleighs, or in the worst terrain, put on snowshoes and carried the mail on their backs. There are records of riders freezing to death, their bodies found days later, the mailbags still strapped to their shoulders. The motto, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night," was not yet the official creed, and never actually was the official motto. But the ethos was already forged in these frozen winters of the 1790s. As the decade progressed, the roads began to improve slightly. The sheer volume of traffic, mail, commerce, and settlers demanded it. We began to see the rise of the turnpike. Private companies, realizing the government could not fund road maintenance everywhere, built improved roads and charged a toll to use them. These turnpikes were surfaced with gravel or crushed stone. They were crowned in the center to allow water to drain off into ditches on the sides. A long pole, or pike, blocked the road at the toll house. When the traveler paid the fee, the pike was turned aside. The post office, however, often argued for free passage. Why should the government pay a toll to use a road that served the public good? This tension between private profit and public service was a constant theme. But the gravel roads meant speed. On a good turnpike, a stagecoach carrying mail and passengers could achieve the blistering speed of 7 or 8 miles per hour. By the late 1790s, the stagecoach was becoming the dominant image of the mail. These were heavy, lumbering vehicles, usually painted in bright colors, red or yellow, to be visible in the woods. They were suspended on thoroughbraces, which were thick leather straps that acted as primitive shock absorbers. They didn't stop the bouncing, they merely changed a sharp jolt into a sickening sway. Passengers on these mail coaches were secondary to the mail itself. If the coach was too heavy to climb a muddy hill, the passengers were asked to get out and walk. If the coach was stuck in the mud, the passengers were expected to push. They sat knee to knee inside the cramped cabin, breathing in the dust of the road, enduring journeys that could last for days. But the network was growing. It was reaching out like the roots of a great tree. In 1792, there were roughly 5,600 miles of post roads. By 1800, that number had quadrupled to over 20,000 miles. The mail was no longer just clinging to the Atlantic coast, it was pushing west. This was the era of the frontier. Settlers were pouring over the Appalachian Mountains into the territories of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. They were moving into the vast, silent wilderness, far from the comforts of the coastal cities, and wherever they went, they demanded that the road follow them. The most famous of these western arteries was Zane's Trace. In 1796, Colonel Ebenezer Zane was authorized by Congress to cut a road through the Ohio wilderness. It was a brutal undertaking. The road was initially just a blazed trail, wide enough for a horse but not a wagon. Trees were marked with axe cuts to guide the way. A post rider on Zane's Trace in 1799 was truly at the edge of the world. He rode through ancient forests where the sunlight barely touched the ground. He crossed rivers that had no names. He carried letters to settlers living in log cabins with dirt floors, letters that might be their only link to the families they left behind in Virginia or Massachusetts. The arrival of the mail in these frontier outposts was a quasi-religious event. The post rider brought proof that the government existed. He brought newspapers that were perhaps 3 weeks old, but to the settlers the news was fresh. They would gather around the fireplace, and the one person who could read well would recite the news of treaties, of elections, of prices in New Orleans. The post road was the lifeline that kept these distant settlers feeling American. Without it, they might have drifted away, forming their own jagged little republics in the woods. As the year 1800 approached, the system had solidified. The seat of government moved from Philadelphia to the new swampy city of Washington, D.C. The post office department moved with it. The physical condition of the roads remained poor by modern standards. The mud was still deep, the dust still choked the traveler in August. The bridges were still rickety wooden structures that creaked alarmingly under the weight of a coach. But the connectivity was established. A letter sent from Portland, Maine, could now theoretically reach Marietta, Ohio. It might take 4 weeks. It might arrive stained with rain, smelling of horse sweat and tobacco smoke. The handwriting might be smudged, but it would arrive. The speed of the horse had not changed. Biology has its limits, but the organization of the horses had been perfected.
The relays were tighter, the schedules were more ambitious. The post road was no longer just a path through the woods, it was a concept, it was a federal guarantee. As we look back at this period, from 1780 to 1800, we see a landscape of slow, determined movement. We see the heavy wheels of the stagecoach turning in the ruts. We see the solitary rider silhouetted against a gray winter sky, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. We hear the scratch of the quill pen in the postmaster's ledger, recording the arrival of the mail from the north. It was a time of tactile reality. Everything was handmade. Everything was carried by muscle. The silence of the continent was vast, but the post roads were the thin, persistent wires that began to hum with the energy of a new nation. The sun sets on the 18th century. The rider reaches the inn. He slides off his tired horse. He hands the leather bag to the innkeeper. The fire is warm. The road is dark. And the mail is safe for the night, ready to move again at dawn.